Thank you. Well, I think we will get started. So my name's Clive Pearson. So welcome to our evening this evening, when we're going to be looking at theological responses to COVID-19. This is the second in our series of COVID-19. The first one was back in November, I think it was, and that was actually looking more at what had happened within the city and the workplace, and all the changes, the practical changes that people had to negotiate through this time of lockdowns and restrictions. And we thought that it would be very good to have an opportunity to reflect theologically as well. I'm going to speak a little bit more to that in just a moment. We do have a couple of apologies. The first is that Dean Drayton has gone to Adelaide. His mother, who's 101, is requiring him now to be there. She's beginning to fail. And so we're with Dean in spirit, but he's not with us in flesh today. And secondly, one of our presenters, Janice McRandall from Brisbane, has had a nightmare of a week with her computer. She's locked out of it and cannot be with us. So what that means is that we can take more time over the presentations we have, and also the conversation surrounding the presentations. We have planned to have a third COVID-19 and theology situation or event in March. And that's going to be a fairly participatory one, where we invite people to bring along a biblical text / theme or a hymn, something which speaks to how they have negotiated their way through COVID-19. So that's going to be very dependent upon what people bring. But Janice will be with us on that occasion, and she will do her presentation then. Simon Hansford, the moderator of New South Wales ACT, is also an apology, but he pre-recorded a message for us to begin with our evening tonight. So Amelia Pereira, are we able to have the Vimeo that Simon did?
Yes, I'll just share my screen now, Clive, and we'll go away. One moment, please. Can you see the right screen?
We can see the screen, yes.
With Simon? Okay, fine. I'll start then.
The ACT, and I'm sorry I can't be there with you this evening. I would have loved to. I bring you the greetings of the Synod of New South Wales and the ACT, and I'm sorry I can't be there with you this evening. I would have loved to have been, but too many things are happening right now. We're asking the question in this conversation about how to articulate the gospel in this extraordinary season of COVID-19, and what that means for the church, what it means for the people who will live in the church as disciples of Christ to be witness to that. Two of the images that spring to my mind most clearly, and I know they are by no means the only images, and perhaps not even the least frightening or extraordinary images, is early on in the season when people were queuing up and battling for toilet rolls in supermarkets across the nation world, and how that's a reflection perhaps of people's concern about what will it mean for me, how will I live, how will I survive when I have no control over this thing. And the second image that sprang to my mind is that of a young woman who'd worked hard in her business, had a nice home, a nice unit it seemed, talking to the camera and saying how she'd lost her job and she had no idea how she was going to live. Now she'd worked hard and done nothing wrong, but her job was over. What was she going to do? And I think those words she was saying have been said by a whole range of people in a range of places now, but more than that, said by a whole range of people in different class structures and different communities throughout history, especially since the Industrial Revolution. With toilet rolls, we have this sense of self-interest and self-concern and fear rolling into a model of exclusion as people fight for them in supermarkets. But the echo of that is heard right now as we talk about the vaccine rollout across the world, as nations are working out whether they can keep them to themselves or whether they're called or invited or challenged to share them with those who have less resource. What happens when fear becomes self-concern and then self-interest first, and then becomes exclusion, so much so that I'm looking after myself, thank you, and others can go and take care of themselves, or not. This is the challenge for us in this season, how we live out this story, how we articulate it in a way that makes sense to the gospel and to the calling upon our lives. We are living in this place now. We're called to this space in time now. How do we sing the Lord's song in this place? The reading from Jeremiah 29 has been used again, and it's appropriate, I think, here. As the people of Jeremiah in exile and confusion are told to live out their faith, live out their lives in a way that implies they will be there in this season for a long, long journey. Marry, have children, plant vineyards, live your lives fully in that place. When our eye is drawn inward, the gospel invites us to lift up our vision and to understand things in a different kind of way. To not think about ourselves first, but to think about the world in which we live and the community in which we are called. The basis of union says, the uniting church acknowledges that the church is able to live and endure through the changes of history only because its Lord comes, addresses and deals with people in and through the news of his completed work. Christ, who is present when he is preached among people, is the word of God who acquits the guilty, who gives life to the dead, and who brings into being what otherwise could not exist. When our eye is drawn inward, Scripture and the story of our church lift our eyes to a new understanding of how to be ourselves, to understand ourselves, and to attend to God's action, God's completed action in Jesus Christ. This story is not the only story that holds us. We are held by a story in which God has already made things complete. So how do we bear witness? How do we attend to this story? How do we live out this season? We do so by seeking first where our eyes are drawn to Jesus Christ. Seeking second where our eyes are drawn to the community and the welfare of others. Because the Jeremiah reading says, plant, marry, bear children, live, grow in this place, and in seeking the welfare of yourselves, in seeking the welfare of the community around us, that's how we bear witness to what God is doing. In its welfare, you will find your own welfare by paying attention to the community around you and offering the hope that carries you into that place. There have been shared songs on the web, shared theatre, shared reading, shared poetry, shared stories, all wonderful gifts as people begin to lift their eyes more fully, and that is who we are asked to be, to live out our lives and our faith in such a way that people's lives themselves are given hope and shape and possibility. Jeremiah says, marry, live and thrive. And that's what we're asked to do, to live and thrive, to indicate the hope that calls us and draws us and holds us. Our hope in this season is located in what God has completed. To articulate that hope in tiny ways and larger ways is the calling upon our lives. You'll hear this evening a whole range of possibilities in song and action and community across our wide community. So let me encourage you to take note, to engage, and to be thankful for these people who are speaking to us this evening about how God is calling us to live out the story of Christ present in every season. God bless you all.
Could you hear that, Clive?
Yes, I could. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Simon Hansford, for his reflection. While I'm about to speak, I'm wondering if someone could send the link to Ellie Elia, because she's been trying to connect and has not been able to. So if someone could attend to that, I'd be very grateful.
I've done that, Clive, and I think she's with us now, I think. So
Good, thank you. That's great. Earlier this year, I found myself doing some research work on the way in which the church has responded to to pandemics in the past. The period we find ourselves in, we are not unique. Over 2,000 years, the Christian faith, the church, has often had to respond to pandemics and has done so sometimes extremely well, and sometimes it has failed dismally. When it has been exemplary, like it was during the very early church, during the plague of Cyprian, it demonstrated a care and concern for not only its own members, but for the community outside. It was governed very much by the language of to love one's neighbor as oneself and the parable of the Good Samaritan. On other occasions, when it didn't do so well, people were very fearful and fled their posts, and mayhem arose. That's what happened in the Black Death. So the church's record is actually very, very mixed. Here in Australia, we've only really had to respond to one pandemic prior to this one. And that has been written up in a recent book by Ian Shaw called Pandemic, the Spanish Flu in Australia. One of the things which is a little bit bothersome about this book is the church and the Christian faith is never mentioned. It is absent. And I think most church histories of congregations don't have much to say about how the church bore witness to its faith in a time of COVID-19, or a pandemic, Spanish flu on that occasion. So sometimes the church has done well, sometimes it's been poor. There's a certain pattern which has emerged about typical types of response. The first has been, even before all of the professional health service and contact tracing and what have you, there has always been a concern for health, safety and security. Martin Luther in 1529, in response to his plague, put that as a priority. But at the same time, when the church has done well, it's also shown a concern for the neighbor, the one who lies outside the church. And indeed, during the time of Cyprian, the thing which stood out for pagan observers was the quality of care and concern Christians showed to their neighbors. And let's remember that in these days, when there was not the professional health service that we now have, the death toll was much greater in terms of, sometimes in terms of numbers, but certainly in terms of percentage of the population. There were also times when advice was given that Christians who were involved in some kind of public utility, such as hospitals, that they should make sure that they didn't depart their post, that they were there available to maintain popular public institutional life. That was a very important thing at times in the past as well. But one of the questions which is sometimes missed is the concern about what happens within worship and what kind of meaning making happens. When the church has dealt well with pandemics, it's also had a focus on what's happening in the life of worship, and also what kind of meaning, what kind of hope are we seeking to provide? Martin Luther was insistent that churches should remain open during his plague, and he did so in order that people could go along and hear the gospel proclaimed, in order, as he said, to live well, but also to know how to die well. I think that's quite an important element, learning how to die well in a time of a pandemic. Well, there have been a number of theological ideas which have been coming to the fore during COVID-19. Some of them weren't quite so helpful. There have been discussions along the way whether or not we are being punished by God for some kind of collective sin. That has featured with one or two writers. It's also featured online. There are also those who have argued that surely this is a signal of the end of time, that time is rolling past, that we're going to have the return of Christ. And that kind of argument has been put forward as well. And you would have heard from Simon that he spoke about what's it like to be present and to live in a time of fear. In the back of my mind, as I was listening to Simon, it made me think of a wonderful book by Scott Bardessay, who spoke about following Jesus in a culture of fear. And it seems to me that goes hand in hand with some advice that Martin Buber, the great Jewish philosopher, mystic, said. We need to place an hour of great care about how we talk about God in times like this, in times of great distress. Angela Tilby's an Oxford-based theologian, and she was becoming very impatient with the Church of England because it was confining its messages for some time to the the protective health and security measures that one needed to put into place, which she agreed with, but and also reflecting about what does one do things online in a kind of digital kind of church. But she was wondering what kind of message was the church putting out at the same time, and she was struck by the relative silence. So in a way, I'm reflecting upon that as well. There have been a number of very fine writings. Pope Francis has put out a wonderful reflection where he speaks about this time of pandemic as being a time of sifting, a time of actually finding out what is actually in the heart of people. Rowan Williams has put out a wonderful little series of just 2 or 3 page reflections called Candles in the Dark, where he gets his readers to reflect upon faithfully, what does it mean to live in a time of where there's false news? What is the truth when there are conspiracy theories about? What is it like to feel solitude, to be locked down? And so picking up some of those everyday experiences and reflecting theologically and biblically about them. So there have been a number of very fine pieces of theological work done, and we're going to have some more examples of that today. And at that point, I'm going to hand over to Michael, who is our first speaker.
Thanks, Clive, and just trust that you can all hear me okay. Yep, thumbs up. Yep. So thank you, and thanks for the opportunity just to reflect a little bit. These thoughts and reflections really come out of my experience over the time of COVID in the last year, both as a Christian in general, but also as a minister of the congregation. And so, you know, kind of what we've faced here, and what meditations and reflections and theological thoughts have emerged out of that. At some point, I can't think when, last year, someone said, it might have been Clive, suggested to me that I might write a hymn, and I did that, and that really brought together what I'm broadly covering in this paper in a hymn form. Yeah, this will be a reflection on all of that. So we'll see how we go. In his recent work, Dominion: How the Christian Revolution Remade the World, historian Tom Holland has argued persuasively, I feel, that Western society is so saturated in Christian assumptions that we take them as a given. Dimensions from the separation of church and state to our widely accepted moral and ethical norms are the result of a vast cultural shading that has so informed our way of life we are generally oblivious to its ubiquitous influence. Holland uses the image of a goldfish bowl. The waters we swim in are culturally conditioned by Christianity to so large an extent we do not recognise that's what they are. In terms of its cultural hegemony in the West, Christendom remains Christendom still, Holland concludes. Arguably, Holland's thesis has been borne out as the world has faced the current coronavirus pandemic. The responses of Western governments, communities and even businesses have been undergirded by a broad concern for the well-being of all people and the community as a whole. The thing about toilet paper being, the fighting over toilet paper being a response out of fear is true, but of course it was roundly condemned by everyone from the Prime Minister on down, which is, perhaps indicative of this broad Christian attitude. Governments have initiated lockdown, public hygiene protocols and restrictions, increased hospital capacities, released stimulus spending, and commissioned urgent work to develop vaccines. Businesses have partnered with governments in critical research and development, have facilitated deferrals for payments, created opening hours to prioritise the elderly, and sought ways to keep people employed. Communities have rallied around with a myriad of charitable endeavours. All of this can be categorised under the same conceptual rubric. It is all reflective of pervasive Christian presuppositions about love, care, compassion, and the inherent dignity and worth of all people, tacitly lingering just beneath the surface. As Tom Wright summarises, Christian innovation was the origin of much of what we take for granted in social attitudes, the gateway through which concern for neighbours has solidified over time. The ancient pagans, he goes on, didn't do it like that. Medicine cost money, so did education, and the poor were poor, so people assumed, because they were lazy or unlucky. It wasn't society's job to look after them. The Christians disagreed. As everyone's mentioning, plagues and epidemics and health crises, none of these are anything new to human history. In the Common Era, Christian responses have often, though as Clive notes, not always, been noted for their selfless sacrificial character. What Gunter Thomas calls unambiguous and extravagant signals of boundary transcending care have radicalised societies whose social contracts drew haughty distinctions between rich and poor, healthy and sick, beautiful and disfigured, accompanied by the requisite moral judgments. The famous remark of the pagan emperor Julian in the 4th century, who noted incredulously that the godless Galileans care not only for their own poor but for ours as well, is indicative. This kind of godlessness seems to have had something to commend itself, and no doubt proved astonishing to hard-bitten Romans who were used to writing off the poor and sick as discards from good society. Christians, in other words, made a difference. The best Christian reactions to such crises have always been characterised by their thoroughgoing, theologically derived contours. Human disasters of all stripes call forth a theological response from the Church that holds together word and deed. Apart from anything else, the obvious question of how belief in an all-powerful, all-knowing, all-loving God is to be reconciled with the reality of human suffering demands a considered answer. But beyond questions of theodicy, the theological lens is, or should be, the Church's primary interpretive frame, as theology is the Church's first language, its mother tongue. Theology is how we understand and reflect on who we are, on whose we are, what a good life entails, and what responsibility we bear as human agents within the purposes of God. The temptation for the Church to default to other paradigms out of expediency or a loss of charismatic nerve, or resort to puffed-up moralising or self-protective defensiveness has always been present and must always be resisted, especially now. It's not been through generalised moral intuitions or what today might be called humanist values that Christians have rendered service during crises, nor cared for the sick, nor found their voices in prayer and praise, nor proclaimed that the hope of the eternal kingdom was locatable even in the face of suffering. The scriptural record spoke of a Messiah who upheld the dignity and worth of the poor, even calling them blessed of God, who took on the form of a slave, making himself nothing out of love for the world, and who died on a Roman cross in shame and degradation to achieve the salvation of all. The Gospels were replete with stories of the unclean being healed through human touch, an act unthinkable according to the mores of the ancient world. Similarly, Jesus had a habit of taking marginalised characters and placing them at the moral centre of life, unsettling the comfortable self-satisfaction of the rich and powerful. In what was a reversal of the accumulated wisdom of ancient traditions, Christians believed that they actually drew closer to the divine truth as they drew closer to those in deepest need, the unlovely, the outcast, the sinners. Jesus, after all, had said, "What you did for the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me." In serving the poor, Christians served their Lord. An image often deployed in recent decades might describe this as performance, a faithful enacting. Christians were playing out God's eternal theodrama revealed in the life, death and resurrection of Jesus, like actors on a stage. Such Christian performances were inspired fundamentally by Christological and eschatological commitments in service to the common good. Good was done to all men, the church historian Pontianus recounts, not merely to the household of faith. The Christian conviction that in his resurrection Jesus had overcome death animated Christian courage. To take up one's cross was to walk the way of sorrow out of love, all the while holding to the biblical assurance that in faithful suffering, and most intensely in death, one was participating in the sufferings of Christ. Christ was present. And far from being something to fear, this Christ-like ark was laced with divine blessing, as it carried the promise of life beyond death and eternal rest with the Saviour. During another health crisis in the 16th century, as Clive's referred to already, the reformer Martin Luther had written in his pamphlet, Whether Christians Should Flee the Plague, "We die at our posts. Christian doctors cannot abandon their hospitals. Christian governors cannot flee their districts. Christian pastors cannot abandon their congregations. The plague does not dissolve our duties. It turns them to crosses on which we must be prepared to die." People just don't talk like that anymore. Christian performances in this regard were characterized by fearlessness, presence, and tenderness in the face of what St. Paul had called the final enemy, a stark and embodied protest against the death-inducing powers of the world, and many lost their lives as a result. So, with this venerable tradition of Christian theopraxis in mind, the same questions arise for the Church in this present crisis. As the community entrusted with the story of Jesus, how is the story to be retold, the theodrama to be reperformed today? Gunter Thomas frames the challenge helpfully. What do we as the Church have to say and do that the political leaders are not already saying and doing? Do we as Christians, as churches, and as theologians have something to say and do that these leaders cannot, may not, and must not say and do? What is a little different this time around, perhaps, at least in some measure, is what Holland is pointing to, the general acculturation of Christian values in wider society. What was once a radical response of a strange religious minority is now mainstream. Still, though, the question remains, what unique speech, what particular performance does the Church enact in this time, and how does it reflect in self-understanding on its practice? Thomas suggests that the Church and theology owe the public a public theology that is orienting. Pastors owe orienting guidance to their parishioners. The Church needs to rediscover the skill of theological navigation. Theological responses have been forthcoming, touching on themes from across the dogmatic spectrum with a view to reimagining how Christians are to be, to worship, to think, to pray, to serve, to speak, to perform in the current time. Tom Wright, writing from an evangelical Anglican viewpoint, for instance, has suggested that lament is the vital initial Christian response to this pandemic. Lament is a strong biblical imperative, pervasive through the Psalms, but less favoured in Protestant practice. Wright posits lament as an appropriate, faithful protest at this time. Things are not as they should be is the proclamation of such lament. God's promise of a new heaven and a new earth, of the ultimate healing of all creation, requires a sorrowing stand in the face of creation's present fracture. Lamentation is hopeful because it anticipates the full healing of a broken world, humanity included. This conviction also explains why Christians have always believed, that ministry to and with the dying was so critical. It is a sign of new creation, at that place described by Reformed theologian Karl Barth as the ridge between time and eternity that is narrower than a knife edge. Christians have walked that knife edge with others in faith for the sake of Christ across millennia. But Wright does not leave it here. Out of lament, he writes, must come fresh action. Wright is very aware of the tensions created for Christian speech and action by a vast global disruption of the kind we are experiencing, even as it is in a historical sense nothing new. Talk of God is complicated already in our cynical age by a raft of additional factors, not least the Church's publicly exposed failures to protect the innocent from predatory behaviour. The Church is no longer trusted as it once was. The situation is then complicated further by such far-reaching crises as pandemics of the kind and consequence we are experiencing. A good God? A lot of the evidence appears to the contrary. Still, though, the Church cannot remain passive when the world is in tumult. It must take courage in hand to speak, to act, to serve, to proclaim the love of God. It must, as Wright says, get on with the job as thoughtfully and sensitively as it can. Peter stepped out of the boat on hearing the call of Jesus and onto the churning sea, despite the threat of the wind and waves. Wright points to the post-resurrection episodes as containing some broadly analogous features to today's situation: the presence of death, fear, locked rooms, doubt, anxiety, tears, and the lingering question, where is Jesus? He sees in these amazing gospel stories lessons that might prove fruitful for the current context. The call of Jesus' followers then, as they confront their own doubts and those of the world through tears and from behind locked doors, he writes, is to be sign producers for God's kingdom. Sign producers is something of a cipher for a more familiar and long-standing Christian term, witness. Wright is wanting to highlight the visibility of the church's performance, bearing public witness to a hope beyond this world, yet that can be known amid the contingency of our mortal state and has spiritual and relational purchase herein. Christian words and deeds speak visibly, audibly of the deeper truth of God's reign come in Christ. Wright recognises the complexities for Christians when the state has taken over much of what were once core Christian practices like healthcare, education, social security. But the dualistic temptation for the church to retreat into the so-called spiritual sphere and keep out of the concrete public square is to be resisted. The call of the church is to witness in a way that points to God's higher love through the visible act and spoken word amid the struggles and strife of the moment. Indicative is Wright's assertion that church buildings are not an escape from the world, but a bridgehead into the world. The church pivots between time and eternity. John Piper, John Lennox and others, despite variances of theological emphasis, offer similar counsel, recognising the persisting vocational command of Christ, and even that the faith has often been spread in such bleak times. There's always an evangelical edge to witness, even if it is not always the first motivation. Further responses have come from other quarters. Clive has noted that the World Council of Churches document Serving a Wounded World in Interreligious Solidarity brings an emphasis to service, solidarity, and the desire to overcome religious prejudice and cultural biases by focusing on the parable of the Good Samaritan. Here the incarnational dimension of witness takes pride of place, the call to be with the world in loving presence, transcending the fault lines of pluralistic environments that manifest in divisions and suspicion. Such proposals are uncontroversial and reflect a variety of faithful reactions. Perhaps, though, these responses draw our attention more to questions of emphasis or accent, to what posture our witness might take, to what tone colours the performance. It is in this respect that a gentle witness, a quiet hope, might have something to offer, enabling the kind of sign-producing visibility of which Wright speaks to emerge. Gentleness is a fruit of the Spirit and reflective of Jesus' engagement with the sick and suffering, with children and the marginalised. Gentleness is Jesus' response to the thief on the cross and his restoration of Peter following the resurrection. Gentleness commends itself as a faithful way at the bedside of the dying, or in company with the tearful father who has been made redundant, or in conversation with the isolated elderly widow confined to home or her aged care room, cut off from loved ones. Gentleness and quietness often go along together. A lovely example of such care was offered by the Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, who's been serving as an assistant chaplain at a London hospital during the pandemic. In his pastoral visiting, he simply goes from room to room, patient to patient, covered from head to foot, not in ecclesial robes, but protective health gear, and attends with the patients, a standard rhythm of chaplaincy repeated in hospitals, schools, military contexts, aged care centres across the world. In one room, he shares with a young girl and her mother. After some conversation, he blesses her, tracing the sign of the cross on her forehead, and prays, and they all smile. The whole scene takes on a sacramental mood through the simple relational gentleness exchanged in loving human connection, commingled with prayer. There was a gentle witness and a kingdom sign. The corona crisis, of course, has seen our churches emptied, our singing muffled, and our gatherings severely restricted. It has generally had a muting effect on the whole of the church's normal life, a life bound up in gathering, proclamation, praise and song. This quietening has been imposed by a foe which pays no heed to such ecclesial patterns. So the church has been forced by circumstance to be quiet in its practice, despite a plethora of noble attempts to find digital or streaming alternatives. None really suffice as replacements for an embodied community of faith and practice. And while an online presence has its benefits, they are always accompanied by the risk of promoting a consumer individualistic mindset. But the church might actually look on this quiet time as more of a gift than a problem, or at least an opportunity to speak and act in a different register. The dynamics of the context seem unlikely to call for kinds of louder witness often preferred in normal times. Arena worship, mass rallies, punchy straplines with associated growth strategies do not work in a pandemic. On the other hand, the potential gift of silence, quietness, the solitary place, the still small voice is replete throughout Scripture as a state in which one might listen for the voice of God. That emphasis proves more fruitful within today's context and challenges, it would seem. And of course, this presupposes a listening people. As the church is a community of word and spirit, listening in humble expectation is always a critical part of the witnessing vocation, a crucial aspect of all faith. Belonging to God, the church listens for the divine voice in Scripture, in prayer, and in the needs of the world before it speaks or acts. In the cries of the suffering, the church hears the yearning of the Spirit for healing and renewal and its call to serve. The church is not in possession of the Spirit, rather the church catches up with the foregoing movement of the Spirit as it blows through the earth. Who of us, for instance, would not say that the Spirit's voice could be heard through the masked, gowned, gloved, tender attention of the health workers as they've cared for the sick to the point of illness or exhaustion? The church quietly looks at this scenario and maintains faith on behalf of the world in the reality and presence of a loving God who is living and active. Such faith might be brought to its articulation in prayers or conversations, even in hymns which can't currently be sung. The church, though subdued, is thus not passive, but still bears witness sensitively as it listens for the lead of its Lord. Such gentle witness may well also include what Thomas calls the additional possibility of remaining courageously and honestly silent, of simply being present as it is able. Some of what has been distinctive in Christian witness during past pandemics is not so distinctive today, at least in developed Western nations. The Christianization of the West has created societies in which care for the poor, compassion for the sick, attention to the dying is taken for granted as a responsibility in some measure of all actors within the community. In this environment, rather than begrudge it, Christians might give thanks to God for the evolution of a more and more compassionate society. This despite the vastly conflicted histories and processes that have led to this point, colonization, imperialism, etc., and the ongoing disadvantage and injustice that exists in a raft of ways. Leaving COVID aside, all else is certainly not as it should be. Maybe the crisis also presents the opportunity for a renewed public dialogue in which the church might participate. Public theologians have made use of the idea of middle axioms as touch points for theological reflection and engagement within the public square, and it could be that shared commitments of care, responsibility, compassion provide conduits into public conversations about what Cynthia Jarvis has called the God issues, themes of personhood, relationship, purpose, and ultimate meaning. A gentle witness might well take flight in such an environment. We might also acknowledge the wide divergences in context around the world and acknowledge that the levels of care, institutional strength, political philosophy and stability vary greatly. Such factors necessarily bear upon how the church in those places responds to the pandemic, how it performs the theodrama, and what responsibility we in the rest of the world have for our brothers and sisters in faith who may be enduring greater suffering. Unquestionably, though, the church will need to be listening faithfully for the Spirit's call, wherever it is placed, and responding in witness that takes the prevailing context seriously. For the moment, maybe in many places, it might consider whether a gentle witness, that accent, in order to perform signs of the kingdom, is a fruitful path to take. Signs by their very nature point beyond themselves, and so it is that love rendered in this way may speak of Christ, even that Christ may speak or sing through them. Thank you very much.
Michael, thank you. That's an excellent paper with a lot of depth in that for us to think about. What I'm going to suggest is I'm going to lead us for the next probably about 6 or 7 minutes, an opportunity to have discussion. I'm going to just give people a moment to pause and think and reflect on what they've heard. So just a little bit of silence, and then some opportunity for questions, for clarification, and then there might be some comment and some discussion. So I'll just pause for a moment. Okay, do we have any questions of clarification on Michael's paper? And you might have to just jump in. Any questions of clarification? Okay. What about comment? What's your responses to what you've heard? Anyone like to go first?
Yeah, I like the idea of the gentle response to people coming out of COVID. Now, we talked about people being scared by COVID, but I think people have also been scarred by COVID, just a change of the spelling a little. So how are we dealing with the scars? Are we assuming people are as they were, in March last year, or do we have to walk with them a bit through the scarring, and how do we deal with that?
Okay. So scarring and instead of scared, and how we deal with that. Another comment?
I really liked Michael's comment about lamentations, and that lament is the Christian response to the pandemic, but fresh action must come from our lamentations.
Yep. So going into prayer and lamenting the situation, but yet not staying there. I think that's what Michael said.
Yeah, that's Tom Wright. So that's that was his immediate reflection, and I'm supporting that certainly.
Yep. So we start in the pain and acknowledge the pain, but we don't stay there, but we don't play it down either. Yep.
I find it interesting that that's come out of an evangelical context, because I think, evangelicals are on about getting on with the job, triumph, rah, 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 not reflecting back on negatives, but the positives. So it's interesting that it has come from that circle. I think it's great.
I think that's a really good comment, I think. And I mean, the irony is, of course, that lament is so pervasive throughout the Bible, and the Bible is the kind of heartbeat of evangelical theology. So we kind of are a bit inconsistent there. Those of us who claim that mantle, if we don't affirm the place of lament.
Sure.
Mm.
So it's not just having a whinge; it's letting it all out with some intent, isn't it?
That's right, and it's hopeful in the sense that it's a protest. It's saying that this isn't how things should be. In God's economy, this isn't how things should be. It anticipates a renewal in some form.
Okay.
Michael, could I ask you? Did you say something like made an observation of how far ahead the Holy Spirit is from where we are at? Was there some kind of a statement that you made like that?
Yeah, certainly that the Spirit is kind of out there before us, and our job is in a sense to try and catch up with it, or to listen for it, to respond to it. Not that the church kind of carries the Spirit like a totem, but rather is in the business of responding to it. So yeah, that's really what I was saying.
Is that it sort of suggests a kind of an approach of discernment, or of looking in places that we are just not noticing, where the Spirit is calling, I assume.
Yeah, 100%, and that's the part there I had about listening, and as you say, discernment and wisdom, and that certainly across Christian history in the biblical witness, it's often in the places of pain and suffering and marginalisation that the church has discerned the voice of the Spirit, calling it into witness, into acts of service and so forth. So, yeah, listening is and that's obviously a humble response, is a primary task, I would have thought.
Thank you.
Another comment or question?
Yeah, an observation that we really have been forced into greater self-understanding of our practices as a church, and I've observed how uncomfortable that process has been for many of our congregations.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, Ellie. I think I was reflecting on this about how one thing, people sometimes summarize this as saying we're not in control. So the pandemic's taught us that we're not in control, and that's true. I think it's also taught us that we've kind of lulled ourselves into the idea that what was before the pandemic, the context, was kind of a flat, plain normality that meant that the church could then act kind of, on that flat plane without needing to give deeper thought to what it was actually doing. So this crisis has showed us that that's not the case, that we can't take for granted that there's a kind of generally comfortable, affluent context in which we can then say, right, what's the church going to be now, but rather that the context is always changing, and when crises appear, as we're saying, I look back on some of the things that we've been doing prior to the crisis and think, that just doesn't hold water when we're dealing with a global pandemic where millions of people are dying, and there's great fear throughout the land. So yeah, it's a good comment.
Just one thing, sort of saying, so that to sort of be listening now and looking to discern and all that you've sort of said, as we are coming back into our churches and things are starting to free up, how do we or just be aware of that? Yes, even more so we need to be listening now. It's not like we sort of bumbled through, or we might have done some good things or whatever, but now we have to go forward in a better way, because as you said, things were not as they should be even before the pandemic. So it's it's being aware of that, and how do we not be tempted to, and I know this has been talked about elsewhere as well, but how do we really still keep listening and lamenting and looking for new action?
Yeah, I think that's really true. And a wise church, I think, will continue to listen and respond in thoughtfulness and faithfulness and so forth. An unwise church will think, how quickly can we get back to doing things the way that we did? So I think that's the challenge in a sense.
Yeah. Now, on that note, I think I know it's probably more comments or questions, but we're going to move on. So I'm going to hand back to Clive to introduce the next part.
Our second speaker tonight is Matangi Vilatama. Matangi is from the Georges River Presbytery, and he's going to give us a Pacifica kind of perspective on his reflections on COVID-19. Matangi, over to you.
Thanks, Clive. And whaalawhala hiatu kia Tau turosi kua whanonga mai ke he mga hawhia whenei. It's good to be here and it's good to be part of this conversation. Talofa lava, malole lei, pula vinaka, ni hao. Good evening, everybody. Firstly, I just want to acknowledge the direct speaking people of the Eora Nation, whose land I am speaking from, and I pay respect to elders past, present, and emerging. Acknowledge also that the God of all creation and God is here with us. I want to start a little bit different from Michael. As a Pacifica Oceanic person, I want to tell a bit of story and some reflection from where I am and as a Pacific Island person. But firstly, I want to just to read out the familiar word of Psalm 46. It says, "Be still and know that I am God. I will be exalted among the nations. I will be exalted in the earth. The Lord Almighty is with us. The God of Jacob is our fortress." The good news in the time of COVID-19, how do we, the church, respond to pandemics? What kind of message are we projecting at times like this? In more practical terms, how is our being church in what is an extraordinary time in our lives? What is the hope that we have in times like this? So the question for me is, how have I, a Pacific Islander minister, respond to COVID-19? There are a few things I want to share with you tonight, perhaps not in a logical order, but Clive will know me as someone who will go forward and back, and sometimes we get confused. I hope you get something out of this reflection. I try to make sense of my faith at this time. At this time last year, I was about to travel to Niue, and 2 weeks in Niue, flight stopped. And on that last day, before the last flight out of Niue, I said to my wife, "Let's go back." So we came back through New Zealand, and we were in quarantine for 3 weeks there. And there, I spent a lot of time reflecting on my faith, and I guess in a way doing theology, faith seeking understanding, trying to understand what's going on right now. And I am reminded that we are not, although we are separated, we are isolated, but we are still connected, because we are part of the whole. And I want to go back to my beginning, where I come from, and who am I, and how do I respond as a Pacific Island person. Last year, at the Being a Multicultural Church Circle, we organized and ran a webinar series on COVID-19, and how does it affect our understanding of Christian history, the church history, pastoral care, worship, mental health, domestic violence. And all of these are on a practical level. It's about liturgy, and it's about pastoral care, but not so much a theology. We did theology in all of these series, but it was to do with the practical things. So tonight is something a little bit different. So what does it mean to think theologically about COVID-19? I've been reflecting on what all of this is about. And to me, is like facing a cyclone. And we're trying to endure this huge cyclone that is continuing to roll over day after day after day. And we haven't kind of anticipated this. It's something that it just dawned on us, just came upon us. And for most of us, it's not a literal storm, but in a lot of ways, it's an image that what we're facing right now is actually, it's a cyclone, it's a storm, because we're not sure what tomorrow will bring, what next week will bring, or what next month will hold for us. It's a cyclone of being out of our control, a cycle of being disconnected from our loved ones and our colleagues, or someone who's lost their jobs. And when you lose your job, you're not just lose your job, but also your livelihood. You lose your confidence and your sense of competence even. It's maybe a cyclone for many of us long-term, those who continue to feel this effect that will go on for months and years. There's great uncertainty. We just don't know how and what this will bring about in the end, and what life looks like after COVID. It's a cyclone for those who might be sick, or whose loved ones might be sick, for those who have died, or people who may need help, or those who just longing and aching for company and human contact. So it's times like this that we are faced against our own finitude as creatures, our own weaknesses, our own confusion, with a keen sense of our own mortality and fragility. So in the past, when people faced cyclones and storms and pandemics or pestilence, they've been moved to return to God, to seek God, maybe in a new way, maybe in a deeper way. I remember in January 2004, I was in Niue Island, in a parish, in a village nestled in a very popular bay, about 100 meters away from the sea. And on that day in January 2004, a Category 5 cyclone Heta hit Niue with little warning, with wind gusts of up to about 370 kilometers an hour. It was unprecedented, it was massive. The sense of helplessness in the middle of the storm, it just could not explain what it was like. And in the house, in the manse, I was there with my two children, isolated, barricaded, but hardly anything could hold the severity of the storm. We were battered, and it went on and on and on into the night. The sense of uncertainty overcame us. It overcame me as a father trying to look out for my little ones. And I wondered about the rest of my congregants, the village. And the next morning, when the storm passed, I walked outside and the whole village destroyed. Everything changed. So when we face storms and pandemics, it causes us to pause, to withdraw within, look deep inside of us and try to make sense of what this is about. Following that cyclone, all the churches on the island were full, packed. Everybody, and I mean everybody, turned up to church on those Sundays. You know, and I'd like to suggest that in some way, in times like the COVID-19, and this is an opportunity for us as a church also to help and to be there for the community and to allow ourselves to experience and in solidarity with those who are suffering, who are also finding themselves in confusion. And while I was in isolation, when we came from New Zealand and we were in a hotel in the city for 2 weeks, those feelings of experiencing that cyclone back in Niue came back to me. And I remembered when as the leader of the church at the time, I went on radio every day. And what came to me as I continued to speak and pray with the people over the radio, that we, the church, must become a community of trust in order that we may faithfully encounter the unknown of the future without fear in new and often challenging ways, in challenging circumstances. The one key question that came to mind was, how can we, the church, live faithfully in a world we cannot control? Because we tend to be in control. So instead of needing to be in power and in control and make everything work out, I think we should attend to our story, our own stories, and our own practices as a church, and seeing them as key to our own deep formation. That we do need to attend to our own story, our cultural stories. We need to find our way back to Scripture again as a community, as a society. We need to find this in our liturgies, in our theologies, in our cultures, and even in our natural environment. So instead of us needing to be in power and to manipulate things according to our desires, the way we think that this is how church should be, or this is how society should be, I think we need to first listen, and listen deeply, and to surrender to the inner voice that speaks to us, and remembering what the psalmist echoed, be still and know that I am God. And I recall the teachings and the learnings from my elders growing up in the island, that we need to observe the seasons and listen to the natural environment to see God in these spaces, in times when we struggle, when we are encountered by storms and cyclones, to find ourselves in the midst of all that there is, in the chaos, in the storms, the cyclone, to find ourselves in the midst of God's community. And being an islander, I'm not just talking about human community, but as Dr. Tofayono Amamalele puts it, all that in the household of life, that's the community that we also need to listen to and to be part of at this time. I was taught that there are seasons. There are seasons in the life of an islander, that we are to find God there in all kinds of seasons, to find our purpose. There are rhythms in the household of life that we need to breathe, walk, sing, and dance to. Because the land speaks, because the ocean dance. Creatures crawl and birds fly to the rhythm of creation. The sun comes up and the sun goes down. We breathe in and we breathe out. The tide comes in and the tide goes out. Ebbing and flowing of life. Sione Haver speaks a lot about shuffle over into the deep and learning to listen and to speak from that environment. For people in the islands, when the tide goes out, the people treads the reef and finds their fill. When the cyclone season comes, the canoes are pulled up to the high grounds. See, God speaks in a rhythm, in God's rhythm, that is present in God's creation. That God speaks to us in extraordinary times. And during COVID, as I sat in that motel, I tried to listen What is God saying? Where is that rhythm? Yes, following the restriction orders, but at the same time trying to find the rhythm. And I think that's the task of the church as well in its theology. Because the rhythm of life as we know it is disrupted. The rhythm of life as the world had given us. The city empty, the community retreats to their own homes in the suburbs. People are called into isolation. How can we rediscover God's rhythm and share and celebrate with the world God's normal? It's also about geography, about the ebbing and flowing, the movement of people into, and also the restrictions of movements. It's not just about physical geography. When I was in isolation, I found myself practicing what Daniel Grudy called traversing the inner geography, the inner contours of my soul. Collectively as a church, is this what we're doing? Have we done this? What COVID had done that forced me to listen deeply, it forced me to ask questions of God. And how often I've gone deep that I need to come out and go out. Friends, I'm reminding of the Psalm 46, that God is our refuge and our strength, our ever-present help in trouble. Therefore, we will not fear, though the earth give way and the mountains fall into the heart of the sea, though its waters roar and foam and the mountains quake with their surging. There is a river whose streams make glad the city of God, the holy place where the Most High dwells. God is within her. God is within her. She will not fall. God will help her at break of day. Nations are in uproar, kingdoms fail. He lifts his voice, the earth melts. The Lord Almighty is with us. The God of Jacob is our fortress. Be still and know that I am God. COVID is a time of rediscovering the rhythm of God. Part of the task of the church, I believe, in doing our theology is to rediscover that. Let me remember very clearly at this time the story of King Josiah. King Josiah, 8 years old, he became king. And during his time, they rediscover the book of the law. And when it was read out, people broke into tears. And they found that the rhythm again. I see that here at this time, our breathing in, that we may rediscover that rhythm again collectively as a church. For the Pacific Island community who crave physical gathering, it is a difficult time, but also a time to understand that we are not just connected physically, we are part of God's rhythm. And how can we do and serve God effectively at this time? How can we be in solidarity and suffer together with those who suffer? And when I listen to Clive and Michael recalling the practice of the Christians in times of pandemic in the past, the sacrifice, they were walking, talking, singing, and dancing in the rhythm of God. And this time, let us rediscover also, no matter how difficult it is for us, acknowledging together the pain and suffering of our people in our community, but how can we create collectively that rhythm and walk with our people? I want to finish by reading from this book I've been reading, and this is the old favorite, Jürgen Moltmann, The Crucified God. I just want to read the first 2 lines. It says, "The cross is not and cannot be loved, yet only the crucified Christ can bring the freedom which changes the world, because it is no longer afraid of death." Thank you, everybody.
Whakaelai. Thank you so much, Matangi, for your input. Then there was some highlights for me as you were speaking, and I really appreciated the storytelling that you drew us into. There was an ongoing theme with that storytelling, both about the travel, which we can no longer do, and the isolation. And it automatically evoked for me thinking about the recent lockdown in Victoria too, the sense of isolation and togetherness contrast. So I was hearing quite a bit about isolation versus community, including your definition of community being the community of creation and its rhythms and times and seasons. I heard very strongly the question that is challenging to us now, which I think you're naming as a priority for theologians to grapple with. How can we live faithfully in a world we cannot control? And I was also hearing a kind of practical theology question about how do we find our way back to scripture, to listening, reflection, and inner geography. So they were some key themes for me. I'm kind of wondering if there are key themes that were jumping out for other people as well. And in particular, we have a number of Pacifica participants as well. I wonder if there are any particular themes that were jumping out for you, because the description of being in the cyclone and being isolated, I think provokes us all to feel our thinking in a different way. And I think for many of us, in terms of articulating our thought patterns, we've had to get in touch with how we feel about them in this past year because of the isolation. So are there particular thoughts arising for others?
I'm not sure whether I'm responding to themes so much, but when I listened to Michael, and there was a question that arose to the effect of, well, how different should the church response be when we do have a society that seems to be very noble and very commendable in its response, that reflects the gospel. And the gentleman, Matiga, I think is the name, made a statement of how to become a community of trust. It almost suggests to me that the difference the church can make, that when the energy gets sapped by all this noble activity and care that we have to resort back to this sense of a community of trust to face the uncertainty, to just keep discerning what to do. So that's what I appreciated most, that connection.
I think, thank you for that. I think part of the struggle that we all have as a church is that we often walk and talk and dance with the tune of that of the world, which is dominated by fear. And I think we do need to be different in that, you know, capturing that same courage that Clive and Michael spoke about, you know, from Luther and those before them who actually made that statement quite powerfully. Do we have a voice? How strong a voice do we have as a church, you know, in the public space during the time of COVID? And what is that message?
Yeah, I think for me that was the big challenge, isn't it? Is this sense of palpable sense of fear that's in the community, and to what extent has the church been, you know, to pick up an image that Michael used, stepping out of the boat. You know, is the church really speaking to the community, saying, well, we refuse to be dominated by this fear? And I would suggest to at least some point an irrational fear, that are we actually stepping out of the boat, or are we simply allowing ourselves to be timid and staying where we are and not really challenging the way we've always done things? I think that for me is the challenge for the church in the current time, I reckon.
It's hard also when the normal way that we would have spoken to people's fear in other circumstances has been to sing our songs of lament and comfort. And of course, we're in a society right at the moment where we're not allowed to sing. And so even speaking the psalmist's words, that was very powerful, Matangi, to hear the psalmist's words. But how much more powerful is it when they are sung? And what happens to us as church when we cannot sing the songs in a strange land?
Yeah. I have a bonus for you later, Amelia, just as we're finishing, when we come to that, because Michael has got, I think, a recording of the song, the hymn he composed. So we sung to, I think.
I'm wrestling at the moment with the challenge for churches. We so easily use the word community, and we struggle to know what that means now. And people, when they've been isolated, and a lot of people are still fearful to come back to church physically, even when it is possible. I think there's the tension between seeing church as the social community, which is so much people are feeling the loss of, and seeing the much broader commitment of this community of faith, the community of trust, that can listen to what's happening around, and also listen for those rhythms. I love the way you spoke about that, Matangi, the rediscovering the rhythm of God. How we do that as communities when a lot of us are still online and kind of fragmented, I think is a great challenge.
Yeah, I was really taken with the phrasing of rediscovering the rhythm of God as well. And one of the things that I've been observing is that I've lived my whole life in the church through what could be described as a golden age of stability and security. And Dad and I might disagree on this, but for me, it's made me realize that the rest of the world has continued to be a church that whole time of my life without any of those things. The rest of the church in most parts of the world don't live with the privilege of stability and security that I live with, and yet they are still the church. And suddenly that's been shaken up for me and for my community, and we don't know who we are anymore, and we're being confronted with our privilege in that. And so that call to listen for the rhythm of God, my deep question is that, you know, that rhythm, that image of hearing something, that stillness in the storm, it's not going to sound, I don't think it's going to sound like the stability and security that I've known. I think it's going to sound like something else. But that's pretty terrifying for someone who's not known what it means to be in a church in a hurricane or a tornado or whatever, a cyclone. So yeah, I think, and someone in my church council the other day actually said that they recognize that because we are in this privileged position where we can return to normal, most of us pretty easily right now compared to the rest of the world, we will miss out on the opportunity of learning from the crisis that we're experiencing in our desire to return to whatever the normal was. And so I feel a sense of being called to listen, to try to listen for God more and more in the storm, and find courage and perseverance in that place.
Thank you, Ellie. I think that's exactly what I was trying to say. It is not the rhythm that we as a church creates, because oftentimes we create a rhythm and expect people to walk and dance on with that rhythm. But listening to and rediscovering God in the storm, and also just observing what's going on around us. And oftentimes God comes to us, and in someone who's not a church, not a Christian, but do we have the discernment to see that? And I think it's a challenge for us to not to be. I mean, the tendency for a lot of churches now is going back to the old rhythm, to the how they used to do church. That's the challenge. That's not. We need to discover, discern what is God calling to us in the new normal we're talking about. What is that new normal? And I believe it's God's normal. Going back to God. And I think that's a challenge for us. But because what is it?
One of the things which struck me in Matangi's reflection was, and he just passed on it quickly, but he spoke about our finitude, in a sense expressing the limits of what it means to be human. And I think we are surrounded by a society which has, for many, many years, really been wanting to be what's next. We can meet this crisis, etc., that sort of mentality. But I think that Matangi highlighted that idea of finitude extremely well, and that kind of, that we're not in control. With regards to what Ellie was saying a moment ago, I found myself reflecting on, I wonder what my ministry would be like at the present time if I was in the UK or America, rather than here in Australia. And I took out a very cheap, short-lived subscription to the Church Times, the Church of England newspaper. I've never done that before. I simply wanted to listen in to how people were responding there. It was interesting that many of the younger ministers wanted to encourage people to have online digital service, and I can well understand that. It's got advantages. But many of the retired ministers didn't want to do that at all. They wanted to have the church as part of the parish community, for it to remain open. And there were surveys done which showed actually a very different kind of ecclesial response to what it meant. But it then left me thinking about what Angela Tilby had said. They had been on the receiving of so many advisories about what you're allowed to do and what you were not allowed to do. She wondered about whether or not we were succumbing to the law rather than to grace. And then she wondered, in an echo of Martin Luther, and I think this is something which might have struck me if I was in Britain or the US. I think I would be trying to reflect on what does it mean to die well. To die well, because I don't think that's been part and parcel of our Australian conversation. Now, I promised Amelia a moment ago that there would be a song. And our time is really coming to a close, and we tried to keep to the limitations of the time that we've set aside. So thank you very much for all joining in with us.
Thank you. Yeah.
We will be sending an invitation out to another COVID-19 theology, but on that occasion we'll be asking you to bring what kind of biblical theme or passage or hymn or whatever it is has spoken to you and sustained you through this time, because I don't think we actually know what have been the sustaining literatures for us during this time. The second thing is that Janice will be with us next time. She couldn't be with us today because of computer problems. We will also post a number of articles which have been published with regards to the theological response to COVID-19, because there have been some very fine pieces of work. And in particular, I just draw attention to Rowan Williams's Candles in the Dark, but also Pope Francis' reflection. It is brilliant. Michael, are you able to take us out with a gentle witness?
Take us out, sure. I'll just see if I can paste the words into the chat and see if this works. Has that gone through?
Yes, it has.
Looks like it has. All right. I think it's cut off a bit of the last chorus. That's okay. I'll now try and see if I can play it, and you'll have to forbear with my somewhat shaky voice. Let me see how we go here. Can you just, when it comes on, just give me a thumbs up if you can get the sound okay? Okay, here we go.
Gentle witness, quiet hope, in myriad pilgrims yearning, the scattered church, a hymn subdued, goes on to God returning, with muffled songs of joy and praise, and muted bells still ringing, with hearts of faith and strains of prayer,
Thank you so much, Michael, for rounding off our evening together in song, and in a way which picked up themes taken really from both of you presenting this evening. And as you were singing, I thought more and more how appropriate was Martin Buber's words from so long ago, that such times require us to place an hour of great care around the way in which we talk about God and our faith. And both of you have done that. Thank you very much for your contributions this evening. Thank you also to Amelia Pereira for organizing us again this evening, and for your participation, and also for Keith and Amelia facilitating those sessions as well. So thank you very much indeed. We'll be back in about a month's time.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Good night.
Thanks, everyone. Good night. Bye-bye. Thank you, Michael.
Bye, everybody.
Bye. Bye-bye.